Good evening. The August 12th, 2021 meeting of the Rent Control Board is called to order. Would the Secretary please take roll?
Yes, Commissioner Foster.
Here.
Commissioner Phyllis.
Here.
And Chair Sultan.
Here.
Commissioner Tarosis and Vice Chair Duran will be absent from tonight's meeting.
Great, thank you. Okay, anyone wishing to address the board on a specific item on tonight's agenda should have contacted our board secretary prior to the meeting. We will recognize the speakers and arrange to have them speak when it's their turn in the queue. I don't believe we have any requests to speak tonight. May I have a motion to approve the minutes of the board's last meeting?
So moved.
I'll second that. Mr. Ho, would you please take a roll call vote on that?
So Chairperson Sultan, is the motion to approve the minutes both of the June 10th and June 14th meetings?
Oh yes, that was my understanding of the motion. Sorry for the lack of clarity.
Right.
Yes, so as the maker of the motion, I accept that as the explanation of what the motion is.
All right, great.
All right, Commissioner Phyllis.
Yes.
Commissioner Foster.
Yes.
And Chair Sultan.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay. Do we have any special agenda items for tonight?
Yes, I do have a couple, but before I do that, do you want to have a report of the closed session from July 8th?
Oh, yes. We should have a report of the closed session. General Counsel, would you be able to report on that?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The Commission convened on July 8th in closed session at 6 p.m. The Board adjourned at 6:18 p.m. with no reportable action taken. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, so Tracy, let's move on to announcements.
Okay, yes, I just have a few things this evening. The rent control registration fees were due in the office by August 2nd, and as of this time, we have about 94% of the fees that have been paid. I'm happy to report that we've had almost 40% of the fees this year paid electronically, so that's about a 7 to 8% increase over last year. So we're moving in the right direction in terms of the electronic payments. For those owners who have not yet paid their fees, they may not increase the rents until they are in compliance with the law, which includes payment of the registration fees. So we did send out rebills at the beginning of this week, and people should be receiving those shortly. If anybody has questions about their registration fees, they can contact the board's office at 310-458-8751. As you know, the general adjustment this year will be 1.7% with a maximum increase of $39, and that can be implemented with 30 days notice written notice to the tenants. And in those rare circumstances where an owner has not taken increases for many years, if the increase is more than 10%, state law requires owners to give tenants at least 90 days notice before implementing a rent increase of more than 10%. I also wanted to mention that the Santa Monica eviction moratorium remains in effect through the end of September. After the emergency ends, tenants will have 12 months to repay their back rent. And we want members of our community to remain safely housed and to recover from the economic impacts of COVID-19. And toward this end, we're working with the city to get word out about the state's COVID-19 rental relief program. You're going to hear more about that this evening, both from Mr. Augusta and Mr. Costello. But I will just say that applications may be submitted at housingiskey.com, and you'll hear more about that. And that's all I have this evening.
Thank you so much. Okay, I don't believe we have any.
Naomi, I've got my hand. Can I make a comment on that?
Oh, yes, sorry about that. Yes, Commissioner Foster.
Director Condon, thank you so much for that. That stemmed from a constituent concern in the last couple of weeks, and thank you for doing that research. I've also been hearing from constituents some concern over another issue, and I wonder if we can perhaps some of our landlords that the pass-throughs are still divided by the number of units for the September 1st increases, but only allowed on certain units that were tenancies that were started before a certain date. There seemed to have been some confusion on that, and I've been getting some constituent communications that they are receiving the pass-throughs when they're not supposed to be. And there's some confusion about, do landlords divide it by that number of units or this number of units still? So perhaps there's room for clarification for a few of our policies and the law as we get back to normal, some semblance of normal, hopefully.
Sure. We do explain that in the summer mailing that we send out to all property owners and tenants. But when the board a couple of years ago spent some time on the tax-related surcharge pass-throughs, the board adopted a regulation that prohibits the pass-through of the tax-related surcharges to anybody who moved in after March of 2018. But the amount is still divided by the total number of units on the property. So certainly anybody that has questions about that, landlords, tenants, should call our office and speak with an information coordinator. We'll be happy to explain that. Thank you.
Thank you both. Okay, I believe now we're moving on to our public hearing. The board will now hold a public hearing to consider regulations regarding agency-initiated petitions. We'll begin with the staff report summarizing the issue, including any recommendation. I believe this is going to come from General Counsel Regan. Is that
yes,
correct?
thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. The Charter empowers the board to not only administer petitions for rent adjustments and excess rents, but also to conduct any hearings that are necessary to carry out its powers and duties. So this proposal would establish regulations to do just that, to allow the agency to initiate hearings, to conduct fact findings related to, for example, a claimed exemption, to ensure that units are being used as intended for permanent as opposed to temporary housing. So these procedures will guide the agency in the conduct of these types of hearings. So staff recommends that the Commission adopt these proposed regulations, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I just want to thank our General Counsel for a thoughtful proposal. I think this is smart. We are, setting out the clear due process provision, rights of our constituents before the board. I think it's great, and I'm in support of it. So thank you.
Commissioner Foster.
I concur with everything Commissioner Phyllis just said, and I won't be repetitive, but I too applaud council and staff for being forward-thinking and looking for ways we can improve our services to our constituencies before it happens sometimes, and being proactive. I'm in support of this.
And I will concur with my fellow commissioners that I'm also in support of the proposed regulations.
I'll move that we adopt the proposed regulations for the reasons stated in the staff report.
Second.
Okay, should we take a vote?
Okay, Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Commissioner Phillips,
Yes.
Chair Salter.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Great. Sorry, my computer is a bit slow today and I'm toggling between items. One moment. Okay, moving on to administrative items. Our first item is from Brian Augusta. This is 12A. Mr. Augusta is the Rent Control Board's advocate and representative in Sacramento and will present a report on the 2021-2022 regular session of the California Legislature. Welcome, Mr. Augusta.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. Nice to see you this evening. Hopefully someday soon I will be there in person again with you all. Until then, hopefully this format allows us to continue to keep you up to date on what's happening in Sacramento. It's been a very, very eventful year once again, especially for both renters and landlords who are struggling to deal with the impacts of the COVID-19 and the economic downturn that has prompted. And I'm going to spend the majority of my time tonight talking a little bit about developments in that regard, and then be ready to answer questions about other pieces of the legislative activity this year. I will say that this is a somewhat unusual appearance because the timing, typically I will come in early to late spring and talk about what's been introduced, and then come after the governor has acted to summarize what's occurred. But given the very significant developments this year, with extension of the eviction protections, it seemed appropriate to come and update you and the public about what those protections provide. And there's also a few really important budget developments which happened at the end of June, and that I want to update you all on as well. So tonight, a little bit different than usual. I actually have prepared a PowerPoint that I'm going to run through quickly for you to help sort of guide the discussion about the eviction protections. But let me, before I turn to that, I want to remind folks about where we are in the legislative session. We have, it being August, we have just today, or actually tomorrow, is the last day of the legislative recess for the summer. And after that, we will return to session for one more month. Largely, all the deadlines for policy committees to hear bills that are moving this year have passed. Exceptions, but for the most part, policy committees are done. So when we return on Monday, the focus is really going to be on those bills that go to the Appropriations Committee. So any bill that has any cost will go to the Appropriations Committee, and we'll have a couple weeks of hearings on those bills. And then it's then all of the focus is on the floor of the legislature and moving bills off of both houses of the floor and to the governor. And there'll be 4 weeks of that activity, Appropriations Committee and floor. And then we're in that period where the governor has 30 days to sign legislation. So we're nearing the end of an eventful session. But one of the very significant things that has happened is that we've had a series of enactments in California starting shortly after the pandemic first hit that that have put protections in place for tenants. And those protections have had a couple of deadlines in which they have expired. The first one was at the end of last legislative session in August, where just before the session ended, we put in place first set of protections in AB 3088, and those expired in January. And those, and then in January, a very unusual sort of legislative session where in January we're debating a bill where usually everyone is just talking about what's coming. So in January, we collectively worked to pass what became SB 91. Those protections, which I'm going to walk through all of this in a moment, but those protections expired at the end of June. And had the legislature not acted, we would have lost those protections. The other thing that has occurred since January is that we have received billions of dollars from the federal government for for rental assistance payments. And so that program began to roll out in about March, and we've learned a lot since then about how that program is and isn't working. And so with the June 30 deadline looming, the legislature worked to pass a replacement bill that both extended eviction protections, but also rolled out some new rules about how we were going to spend those rental assistance dollars. So I'm going to walk us through that briefly here to summarize sort of where we stand, which I think will hopefully be a good setup to Mr. Costello's presentation following mine about the efforts that are being made to help folks access those dollars. Give me one moment while I find my... At the end, hopefully you're seeing on your screen the beginning of my presentation.
Yes, we do.
Great. So, as I mentioned, we faced this deadline on June 30th, and the legislature acted to extend it. And it enacted AB 832, which had bipartisan support, moved off of the floor fairly quickly and easily, and went to the governor, who signed it, and because it was an urgency measure, as soon as he signed it, it became law. So it did a number of things. The first is that it extended all the protections that were enacted in AB 38 and SB 91 until September 30th of 2021. So that includes a lot of protections about prohibiting retaliation, prohibiting selling or assigning COVID rental debt, a number of other consumer protections. But most significant is the state eviction protections, which generally prohibit the eviction of a household for non-payment of rent that's related to COVID, provided that they return a declaration and that by a certain date they provide at least 25% of the rent that has been accrued. And so those protections, have been in place. By the time this new law expires, will have been in place for a year. What that would require is that by September 30th, if you provide all the declarations, you pay the 25%. You can never be evicted for the non-payment of rent, but you can still be subject to a civil action for the remainder of the rent. Now, 3088 had some protections against when those civil actions to collect that rent could be commenced, and those protections have been extended until November. Most other sunset dates, as I've mentioned, are extended by 3 months, with two exceptions. One is the sunset there was a provision in the first two bills that prohibited the release of unlawful detainer or eviction action and debt collection actions from being released to the public. We call that masking. And those protections were put in place, but they would have expired if we had followed the same pattern. They would expire at the end of September, exactly when all of those actions would start to be filed. And so really wasn't protecting folks from the potential impact of their credit report. So in the most recent bill, we have eliminated that sunset, making that masking permanent. The other thing, which is of great interest in Santa Monica and elsewhere, is the local preemption provisions that were first enacted in AB 3088, which put certain limits on what local governments can do to limit COVID-related evictions. Those preemption provisions, which we've talked about in prior meetings, those will be extended through March, through the end of next March. Why the end of next March? Talk about that in a moment. So as I mentioned, the eviction protections that we've all become familiar with, 25% payment standard, those will end at the end of September. So what happens at the end of September? Well, this new bill provides that from October 1st through the end of March, a landlord cannot commence an eviction action unless the landlord can show that they've actually applied for the rental assistance that's available, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and that the application was denied. So in a more technical sense, they can't get the summons, the very first step in the eviction action, the thing that they serve on the tenant that says you must come to court and answer this eviction. They cannot get that unless they can make that showing that they applied and it was denied. And even if they do that, tenants are further protected if during the course of that eviction action, all the way up until the point at which a tenant might be locked out by the sheriff, the tenant can make a motion to say, Your Honor, I have a pending application for rental assistance. The rental assistance application has been approved, but I have not received the money. And so the case will be stayed over a course of possibly several stays until either the rental assistance is provided or there's some reason that it won't be provided. And if once the tenant receives that, it resolves the eviction action, then at that point, in other words, it provides all of the assistance or all of the rent that was disputed in the eviction action that was the basis for the eviction, then the eviction case will be dismissed. Now, the idea here, of course, is we want everyone to access the several $1 billion in federal assistance that's been provided to settle out that rental debt, both to make the landlord whole, but also to protect the tenant from a debt collection action and eviction. So if that money is sitting there, we want both parties to apply and be active participants in getting the money and prevent the eviction and ensure that all parties are whole and the tenant is protected, from the potential impacts of that debt. So the state has erected several sort of off-ramps to a potential eviction action where that money is sitting there, a tenant is eligible, but they have not yet accessed it. Now, in addition to those eviction protections, the state also changed several of the rules around rental assistance. You may remember that in the January bill, the rental assistance that was provided was conditioned on the landlord waiving a certain percentage of the back rent. So it mostly said that if a tenant paid, if the landlord would get 80% of the back rent, so if they waive the additional 20%, so they're getting essentially 80 cents on the dollar, in part because of changes in the second set of payments that came down under the Biden administration, and in part, I think, to help liberalize the delivery of that money and encourage participation. The new rules say tenants and landlords are eligible for 100% of rental arrears that have accrued since April. So there's no dispute that landlords who apply will be made whole for all of that unpaid rent that tenants have not paid because of COVID. In addition, tenants can apply directly on their own if the landlord does not apply for rental assistance. That was one of the problems that we experienced in the interim between January and June, was that we were seeing not as strong an uptake from landlords, and tenants could only get assistance if the landlord applied. So this now allows tenants to apply directly. In addition, eligible tenants can get 100% of prospective rent. So not just arrears, not just what's accrued up till now, but potentially prospective rent if needed, up to a maximum of 18 months. That's the federal rule of total rental assistance to the tenant. And one other important change is that tenant who has already moved out, the landlord can still get payments for that back rent. Now that might sound like that favors the landlord, but it actually helps protect the tenant who, fearing some adverse action, had moved out because they couldn't pay their rent. Now they have this debt hanging over their head. This provision allows for relief of that by allowing the landlord to receive assistance for that. Now, as we'll talk about in your next segment, the application process has, the rental assistance program has not gone, I think, as well as folks had hoped. We've had, it's been fairly slow to get the money out, but the numbers are definitely trending upwards, which is encouraging. I think, as most folks know, the application process previously had been very onerous, something like a 32-page application that both discouraged participation and slowed the pace of applications. That has picked up. The application has been simplified. That process seems to be going well. As I noted in our written report to the board, the numbers are still low, roughly around 25% statewide and maybe 37, 38% in the city of Santa Monica, according to the data that the state is posting on their website. So still a lot of work to do, and importantly, really critical that that work, that outcome occur before the end of September, because everything is so closely tied to tenants receiving the rent, landlords receiving the rental payments from the tenant. And if that doesn't happen, yes, as I discussed earlier, there are some off-ramps, but those are with some amount of peril because the tenant is already in an eviction action. It relies on the tenant knowing to assert their rights. So I think all parties, from the state, the landlords, tenant advocates, folks like yourselves and your staff, are working very hard to make sure that we get that money out as quickly as possible, that we make people aware of it, and that we ensure that we don't have dollars sitting on the table when we get to September 30th. And one question that may come up is, what if we do get to that point? Well, we're at a point in the legislative session where there's only a month left. And once they adjourn, really absent a special session, not really a mechanism for the legislature to extend the eviction protections that we've talked about, that prohibit eviction for non-payment. So it would take an extraordinary measure to make that happen, unless it happens in the next month, to extend them, which I will say I don't anticipate that. But if the pace continues to be slow, less than 50%, I think that's a conversation that Sacramento will likely be having. So hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully we can get the dollars out quickly. We can protect folks from eviction and get the dollars where they need to go. So with that, let me turn to the main screen. I would just quickly note on non-eviction matters, we had a fairly significant budget surplus. We have several $1 billion that we are investing this year in housing. 1.75 billion is being rolled into existing housing developments that have received some form of HCD funding, but we're looking for more funding. We're going to take 1.75 billion, put it in those projects that are shovel ready, with the hope of quickly moving those projects forward. We put several $1 billion into HomeKey, the state's signature program on homelessness that moves folks into or converts hotels and motels and other multifamily housing to immediate relief to folks who are homeless. We've done a number of other multi-million-dollar investments in housing. I won't go through all of those, but the state has invested quite a bit of the surplus and the federal dollars that have come down into housing and homelessness. So encouraging news there that hopefully we will see some results from that. So why don't I pause there, because I know that 832 is really what's on most folks' minds. I will also, Madam Chair, invite questions, of course, on any other legislation that the board is interested in. So with that, I will hand it back to you.
I just want to thank you, Brian, for your time here tonight. You always do an excellent job keeping us informed. And I know this year is, particularly difficult as we're trying to figure out how we're going to emerge from the pandemic. So I just wanted to thank you, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Before I turn it over to Commissioner Foster, I also wanted to thank you for that presentation was actually quite succinct, because it's a really complicated law. I know, because it's something the agency that I work with in my day job tries to explain to tenants through presentations and one-on-one on a daily basis. And so I felt like your presentation conveyed a lot of complexity, pretty clearly. So I really do appreciate your boiling that down for us and our constituents. Commissioner Foster, you had a question, comment?
Oh, yes. I mean, in Carolyn's absence, somebody has to put Brian through his paces.
I was going to escape that. Okay, fine.
So, yeah, I agree with what they said. You explained that brilliantly, and we have an item right after this talking about our local outreach efforts, so I'm not going to belabor that. That's how we should be spending our surplus money and our CARES Act money and our rent relief money. It's exactly how it should be being spent. AB 854, Lee. So he was a guest here locally last week in Santa Monica and did some talking about this. What do you hear about this now 2-year bill, the Ellis Act 5-year rule?
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah, what happened? So this is a bill, thank you for bringing that up, Commissioner. Assemblymember Lee, who's from the Greater Bay Area, introduced this bill, very enthusiastic about Ellis reform. And this is a measure or a policy that has been tried in years past, most prominently by Senator Leno of San Francisco when he was in the legislature, that would provide some kind of holding period before a property owner can access the Ellis Act to remove the property from the rental housing stock. The idea being that while Ellis is supposed to provide an off-ramp for those who are in the rental housing business and want to get out, to use it for someone who buys a property and then immediately Ellis is knowing that they're buying a property subject to rent control and then assert that they want to exit the rental housing business. That's really not what Ellis was intended to apply to. And so the bill would have established a time period, a limit, that you had to have owned the property for some amount of time before you could access the Ellis Act. That policy continues to be controversial in Sacramento. Obviously, the landlord groups, realtors, apartment association who fight to protect the Ellis Act, which they helped pass many years ago, were obviously opposed. The bill was set to be heard in the Assembly Housing Committee. It was not brought up for a hearing. I don't know all of the conversations that might have gone on behind the scenes, but typically if a bill doesn't come up for a hearing, it's because they're at least short a vote or two. And that being the case, Mr. Lee parked the bill. It's now a 2-year bill. It can be heard in January. That's a tough path for a bill because it would need to be heard in that committee and off the Assembly floor in 1 month, which is something that would normally occur over several months. So having said that, I'm confident this is a conversation that's going to continue in Sacramento, but for all the reasons I was just talking about, so much of the focus and energy and political capital has been focused on the immediate eviction protections, that measures like this just haven't gotten been part of the conversation in the same way.
That's too bad, because they are also preventing displacement is just as important as building new units. Along that line, can you give us an update on SB 9 and 10, momentum, chitter chatter in Sacramento, and how those are proceeding?
So, yes, so SB 9 and 10 are part of a package of bills that Senate leadership is pushing, a package of production bills intended to expand the supply of housing overall, with the notion that by doing so, we help to bring down housing costs. SB 9 is focused on creating opportunities for small subdivisions, either a duplex or lot split, that in single-family zones. I will note that that bill has protections similar to other bills that we've seen in recent years that limit its application to, among other things, a property that has been subject to a local government's rent control, price control ordinance, and any property that's been recently occupied by low-income households. Having said that, that bill, I will say, has not gotten as much attention from equity and tenant advocates as SB 10, and it continues to move, and it's, has the stamp of approval from the Senate President Pro Tem, Amy Atkins herself, so it has some political support behind it. SB 10 by Senator Wiener is a bill that would allow, distinct from the other one, which is sort of preempting local limits. SB 10 says that local government may do a certain thing, which is zone for units up to, or rezone a parcel for up to 10 units per parcel, which is a slightly unusual distinction. Usually, as you know, when we talk about zoning, we usually talk in some respect about units per acre or density in that regard. And this is just 10 units per parcel, regardless of parcel size. So that's somewhat unusual, but that bill would allow for that kind of zoning to be enacted, and if enacted, then that approval of those projects up to 10 units would be ministerial. There's been a little bit more concern over that bill because it jumps over sort of the local approval process, and for that reason, some groups, equity groups, tenant groups, are watching it more closely and have urged some amendments to help ensure that those are sites that are not going to further displace or gentrify vulnerable low-income neighborhoods. But to your question, it too continues to move, and I think this next month will sort of define where that bill goes. And then ultimately, of course, it goes to the governor's desk, and I don't think we know yet what the reaction might be to that.
Thank you. I think I had one more. Housing and commercial zones. That ended up as a 2-year bill. I'm really surprised that Bloom's AB 115 was not more well received. What happened there?
So Mr. Bloom's bill, along with another bill in the Senate housing package by Senator Caballero, both had similar policies to allow residential by right in certain commercial zones. What I haven't touched on in this conversation tonight is that in many of these bills, there's another factor going on, which is the state building trades that represents construction workers has been pushing for policies that ensure that if we're streamlining the production of housing in a way that jumps over CEQA and other discretionary review, that we have policies in place that ensure that a skilled and trained workforce is used on those. Now, in Mr. Bloom's case, that bill did not have that language in it, and it had opposition from the building trades, and it didn't move forward. Not entirely clear whether it was that or some other factor, but the bill did not move forward. With respect to Ms. Caballero's bill, it does have language in there. It moved through the Senate. When it got to the Assembly, it has since been essentially held in the Rules Committee and has not moved forward. And there's a couple of other bills in that same vein. So unclear exactly what's going on, but one can surmise that the dispute over labor standards in those bills probably plays a factor in their not moving.
Well, thank you very, very much. I hope our legislature can do a little better than being so singularly focused and narrow focused the last couple of sessions. We need to continue to, do all of the work and not just the narrow focus. Narrow focus is very important, but so are these other items like continued Ellis reforms and Costa-Hawkins. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In person, can't wait for the nation to get healthier and you'd be able to come back and see us.
Me as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Augusta, for coming and giving us that very helpful update. Unless there are any other questions for you, I suppose we can let you go.
No questions, just gratitude. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. That was a good, succinct presentation about the bill, so thank you for that, the program. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, let's move on to administrative item 12B, which is information on the city's outreach efforts to inform owners and tenants about the COVID rent relief program that Mr. Augusta was describing, and request to authorize up to $10,000 to be used in those efforts.
Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. I also wanted to thank Brian for that presentation. I think it's very clear where we're at with the COVID-19 rent relief program. There's $7 billion available for eligible households to get 100% of unpaid rent and utilities. And we want to make sure that all landlords and tenants know that they can apply for this assistance. As he described, the application process was a little difficult, may still be. And initially the money was slow to come, but we at the Rent Control Agency, along with our partners in the city and the community, are working on an education outreach program to encourage landlords and tenants to get the money that they might be able to get. According to the Housing is Key online dashboard, as of yesterday, 1,317 applications were received from Santa Monica households. 522 households were served. 21,435,844 was requested, and $8,656,649 were paid. So that's more than that's 67 households more than just last week when the staff report was initially prepared, and it's more than $1 million more paid in 1 week. So the program doesn't, as we know, have a deadline for accepting applications, but since the eviction moratorium is expected to expire on September 30th, we really want to urge everyone who's eligible to apply as soon as possible. And tenants who are facing housing insecurity should apply before September 30th, as they could be at risk of eviction, despite the off-ramps that maybe might be there. But we really believe that strong and clear messaging from the city in the next few weeks will be critical in promoting this recovery and protecting the housing stability for Santa Monica residents. And with that urgency, we have developed this rental assistance education outreach program. The program has 2 goals. The first is education to inform all Santa Monica tenants and landlords of the federally funded rental assistance program, and to provide guidance on how to apply. The board's website currently features general information, links to the Housing is Key website, phone numbers, and other city websites and governmental institutions or websites have information about this. But we believe that another level of education is required, and we're going to try to focus on reaching tenants and landlords who may need some kind of assistance with their applications. So this would be working with the most vulnerable residents who may not have access to online information, including residents with disabilities, those with language barriers and or immigration status concerns, and those who face technical barriers. Some people don't have an email account or a computer or internet access, which makes it difficult for them to apply. So this effort will rely primarily on low-tech tools to reach the targeted audience. And the general framework is this. First, we're going to begin with a broad outreach. Postcards are going to be mailed to every household in Santa Monica, approximately 55,000 of those. And the material will be provided in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Farsi, and Amharic. And then we're going to follow up with a little bit more targeted outreach to approximately 27,000 rent-controlled units and 4,000 property owners at 2,000 mailing addresses. So these postcards will be mailed out, and then they're also going to be distributed to clients of the Disability Community Resource Center, Meals on Wheels, and other potentially vulnerable communities. I know that distribution is planned at the food pantry boxes and after-school programs at Virginia Park, the library, and the farmers market. Following that, we'll be further targeting and doing door hangers to specific groups. Mainly, this is going to be the long-term rent-controlled tenants, and we have about 7,000 households, and also residential buildings in specific areas of the city. Then we're also planning to have generally posted posters and flyers that will be at targeted businesses and institutions. So we're looking at food banks, grocery stores, laundromats, thrift stores, places of worship, parks, community centers, any place that will take them, really. And then we're going to complement all of this with an outreach effort that goes across a lot of platforms that maybe aren't so low tech, but social media. So there's a calendar of communications that's scheduled for Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, probably weekly posts. We're going to be targeting some Santa Monica zip codes for ads on social media. We've already begun email blasts, so we're using the rent control mailing list, the city's mailing lists, various departments, and we're asking some of our community partners to get the emails out to their constituents as well. We already have videos running on City TV in Spanish and English about the program, and we're going to be sending out SM alerts. And the September issue of Seascape, which is mailed to all Santa Monica households, will feature this program on the cover. And I understand that the water bills starting next month will also include information about the rental assistance program. So, of course, we have things on our website, and we're also trying to work with the various community partners that I mentioned before for their assistance, and also possibly to provide some services. So the second goal is actually to provide some support, and we want to ensure that all eligible tenants and landlords have the support they need in applying for the rental assistance and ongoing support after an application has been submitted. So in our marketing materials, we're going to initially direct tenants and landlords to the Housing is Key website. People do need to apply on the portal there, although there are some other ways to apply that we think we can help people with. There are some applications that can be accepted by PDF and by telephone. So although we initially direct people to Housing is Key, for anyone who thinks they may need assistance, we are working with our 311 team, Santa Monica, and they will be able to answer basic questions about the rental assistance program. And then they're going to ask questions from the callers about what kind of assistance they might need. And then we can coordinate making referrals. We can follow up with them, and we can schedule in-person appointments with them. So one of the ideas for in-person appointments is to use city facilities and have a weekly clinic, kind of that Wednesday evenings when people could come in, and that clinic will be monitored by the city attorney's office. But we're looking for a nonprofit community organization that might be able to staff that space. So right now we are talking with the Housing Rights Center. They have already received funding from the state as a community partner, and they have to assist people throughout Los Angeles County. But they have applied for additional funding for 2 additional staff persons to work in Santa Monica. So they'd be working at that city space. We don't know at this moment whether or not the application will be approved, but the organization would or has offered to provide training to volunteers or city staff who may help with the in-person services. We imagine also that rent control staff could play a role here. So if people need to come in and have their documents scanned or something uploaded, we are already working out of that space, and so we would be able to meet with those people by appointment. But this part of the program is still being developed. So as far as funding and expertise, so this is a collaborative effort between council and various city departments. At their July 27th meeting, the city council voted unanimously to allocate up to $25,000 in discretionary funds to the outreach effort. The city's community services department is committed up to $20,000 for communications, and in general, the city attorney's office is leading this effort. But we feel there's a role for rent control. The total costs for the program, primarily printing and postage, are estimated to be $55,000. And given the importance of this program and the urgency of keeping tenants housed, and the desire to ensure that landlords are made whole for their unpaid rent and utilities, staff recommends that the Rent Control Board authorize an expenditure of up to $10,000 as the agency's financial contribution to the outreach program. This program is potentially a win-win for landlords and tenants, and will allow city funds to be leveraged for a broad campaign reaching property owners and tenants of rent-controlled units, some multiple times. And a contribution of this amount will ensure that planned efforts are sufficiently funded. So if you have any questions about the program, I'm happy to answer them for you. Thank you.
Commissioner Foster?
Hi, thank you, Chair. Dan, thank you so much for that great presentation. It was very thorough, and just like Brian's, it was very informative, and I'm so thrilled to hear that we're going to use, cross-agency resources, city resources, in-person, the outreach to organizations that all of us commissioners have some links to, including things like Meals on Wheels and other organizations. That's just so smart and so clever to layer this upon layer with the idea that the more layers we make, the fewer people fall through the cracks. There's a lot of lack of awareness on the part of some of our special needs tenants. And this is just so necessary to use those organizations that touch them where they live, that walk through their door with meals and other resources. That's really, really bright. And I, for one, wholeheartedly support our contribution. That is a fiscally responsible contribution on our part still, but I think it's well warranted and needed, and welcome the other commissioners' comments. But I'm not sure, Tracy, Chair, do we need a formal motion on this, or is it consensus, or is it an actual motion?
I'm actually not sure.
Well, under our meeting via video conference, everything needs to be done by an official motion. So yes, it would be.
We're allocating money, right? So that's
Yes,
right.
you should have a motion and second and take a roll call vote.
Well, like I said, I welcome other comments by the other commissioners, but I would like to move that we allocate this $10,000 as prescribed by staff in this effort.
Second.
Okay, let's take a roll call vote on that motion.
Yes, Commissioner Phyllis,
Yes.
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
and Chair Sultan.
Yes.
Motion carries.
And I also wanted to say thank you, Mr. Costello. That I made me so happy to hear about all the outreach efforts, and particularly, through all the community-based organizations reaching out to folks that may not have the digital literacy that some of our perhaps younger tenants have. And I love the idea of an in-person clinic to help people complete the rental assistance form, because I know so many people have struggled to complete the online version or the over-the-phone version. So I think it's a wonderful idea. And maybe I can even volunteer there when it gets up and running. So thanks so much.
Thank you. And I just want to give a shout out to also the Office of Communications, because they're in the city manager's office, but they've been really helpful in helping us coordinate this campaign. Kudos to them.
Hey, I believe we have gone through the agenda and are at the moment in the meeting where we may adjourn. Our next meeting is scheduled for September 9th, 2021, 7 p.m. Assuming at this point it will also be via teleconference, although that could theoretically change. Let's take a vote on adjournment.
Move to adjourn.
Oh,
Second.
and adjourn. I always forget that part.
Got you. I got you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis,
Yes.
and Chair Sultan.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.